invested, started lifestyles, and developed a resource, and we're going to have to start cutting back on that use there. Curtailment, next bullet, it's obviously socially and economically disruptive. Sorry, can you pop back? And then no action is not an alternative. We can't just ignore this. Let me back up. We shouldn't just ignore this. Again, we've got statutes that want us to maintain reasonably stable groundwater levels. And obviously, if we're going to maintain some economic threshold in some of these basins and provide water for human consumption out there, we've got to get these declines under control there. So these are the three key decision points that certainly interested in hearing feedback from you all on as to how I present them. And obviously, I'm trying to provide food for thought for the commissioners, get their thoughts and questions answered. This discussion that we'll be having with the Water Resources Commission on Friday is probably one of many that will be coming up in the next couple of years as we wrestle with issues in the Division 512 rule process there, and as we expand out to other areas that have declines. So the first decision here is establishing what I'm calling a target water level trend. I think that's the first thing that we're going to need to get figured out. Following that will be establishing a permissible total withdrawal, or PTW. That PTW is a statutory term in the critical groundwater area statutes. It's not defined, but it is something that we will include in the rules that will be part of establishing critical groundwater areas. And we'll talk about that more here in a second. And then is really the implementation schedule and volume reduction that we should chase after. As we go to reduce groundwater level declines, we have to reduce groundwater use. And how we get to that and how quickly we get to that matters a lot to the groundwater users out there. Next slide, please. So establishing the target water level trend. This is a water level trend for long-term management. I think points for consideration: should that trend be zero or essentially no decline? That would be akin to the first hydrograph we showed for that well in South Grant County there, where you've got groundwater levels that are in dynamic equilibrium. They fluctuate seasonally, but are essentially not declining at all over the long term there. That option is going to be most protective of existing users on the system and the ecosystems there. But it will also come at the price, if you will, of probably the largest amount of groundwater use reduction in the system there. Should the target water level trend be basin specific? Should it be a statewide standard? Those are just, again, questions for consideration. When we talk about a basin specific standard, should it be granular enough that it actually gets down to like a sub area level, where we may have a critical groundwater area for the Harney Basin? There could be a dozen sub areas or so. Should each of those sub areas, at least the ones where we think we need to do curtailment, should they each have their own target water level trend? Or should, again, it be more of a uniform trend across the whole basin or the whole state? Next slide. So I have some pretty basic graphics to share here, just to kind of illustrate the difference in choices. This is, I guess, an example hydrograph. A vertical axis is depth to water and feet below ground surface. The time scale on the bottom is a 20-year time scale from 2024 to 2044. All of our groundwater levels here are starting in 2024 at 10 feet below land surface. So at least at this aquifer system, there hasn't been much of a decline. But if we map out no decline, obviously that's going to show up as a horizontal line. and maintain a 10-foot depth to water over the next 20 years. The next line down is a green line there at 0.5 foot per year. So at that decline rate over 20 years, we'd see about 10 feet of decline in that particular aquifer system. If we expand that or allow up to 1 foot a year of decline over 20 years, obviously 20 feet, and then 5 feet per year would get us 100 feet of decline. So in 20 years, that water level in that particular system, if it was managed or not managed, would decline from 10 feet to 110 feet below land surface there. That would, in essence, double the current definition of excessive decline there, and obviously would have detrimental impacts. So I just wanted to use this slide as an example. We see decline rates that vary from, again, 0 to well over 5 feet per year. I think our worst ones in Harney are ranging from 8 to 10 feet per year in one of the sub areas. So it would be twice the rate of that lower blue line there. But this will help kind of frame this portion of the discussion for the commission, and hopefully, kind of seed some questions and some thought processes there as well. Next slide, please. Second decision point. Once we establish a water level trend that's acceptable or desirable, we can start having conversations then about, well, what's the permissible total withdrawal? Again, PTW for the acronym there. That permissible total withdrawal, I guess I would define it as the annual volume of groundwater that can be pumped from the critical area or a sub area within the critical area to achieve that target water level trend. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. Next slide. So some of the data that we're going to need to come up with the permissible total withdrawal. What are the current water level trends in that part of the aquifer system? What is the current groundwater use? And I'll distinguish that here between allocation. Allocation is what we've issued on paper, the paper water rights. The water level trends, though, are actually responding to actual use. And so the work that we did in the Harney used the satellite imagery to estimate the consumptive use off of the irrigated fields there, as well as estimate use from some of the other discharge areas. And so that's really what we're trying to total up. And then again, we're going to factor in that target water level trend. That's the goal of water levels after active management takes place, where we're headed. Next slide. So what are the different approaches to calculate or estimate a permissible total withdrawal? We've come up with 3 so far. Interested in your all thoughts on these. One is a hydrograph approach. So this might be the most graphical one, where you look at hydrographs of wells over time, find the inflection point where the groundwater declines began, go back in time and assess the groundwater use at that point in time. And that would, in essence, give you a sense of how much groundwater use was sustainable or usable out of that aquifer system before decline started to take place. That also could help provide a priority date in time. So water rights junior to that particular point in time might be those that would be subject to either voluntary or some sort of regulatory reduction in use over time. Another option would be a simplified rate analysis. So again, if we've set a target water level trend and we know what the current sub area rate of decline is, or critical groundwater area rate of decline is, we can assume that the reduction in pumpage would be directly proportional to the change in the rate of decline. As an example there, if the current decline rate is 5 feet per year, and we want to reduce that to 1 foot per year, then we would reduce the decline rate by 4 feet per year, which means we'd probably have to shoot for an 80% reduction in use for implementation to get us to that target water level trend there. Yes.
The fallacy there is we don't know the rate of what no decline is, the rate of usage at a stable.
That's true. In some cases, though, like in some parts of the Harney Basin, we have some decades of groundwater use where the water levels appear to be stable.
But do we have accurate usage from that, or is it just estimated usage?
I think that's the inflection point was about 1990, and we have satellite imagery back to 1985. So we might be able to estimate at least the last 5 years of that with some degree of, yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
But you're
Good question.
well, first of all, as chair, do you want to continue and then handle all questions at the end, or do you mind?
I don't mind some questions.
We don't want to get sidetracked.
Yeah, I've just got a few more slides here, so why don't I power through them and then we'll take questions.
No, that I was chomping at the bit myself.
Let's see. One of the other approaches is the modeling approach. So this would require numerical flow model simulations. For the Harney, we are working on a model down there. So that would be an option. Although the timing of that is going to be awkward. One of the discussion points here, in my mind, it might make sense to define the permissible total withdrawal as the amount of use that the aquifer can sustain with no decline. Again, the PTW is an annual volume number that's going to be set in rule. It doesn't necessarily need to be the target for groundwater reductions, certainly not in the near term, and we'll talk about that shortly. But I think it would give water managers and water users an annual volume estimate to be used as a baseline for decision making. Open for discussion on that, but again, it might make sense to set that PTW as our best estimate of the volume that can be pulled out annually from that system with no declines in water levels, and then manage towards that accordingly. Next slide. So we've set a target water level trend. We've come up with estimates of PTW for the critical area or sub areas within the critical area. Now it's the implementation. And I think really what I wanted to kind of lay out there for folks to consider is what is the actual target for reduction in use, and what's the schedule of attaining that, and how will that be established? And so we have work to do to figure that out. But I'm certainly interested in folks' thoughts and input on that. Next slide. So as far as reducing uses, any number of different ways to do that. We're standing up or have stood up the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, or CREP program, in the Harney Basin. That's an opportunity for landowners to come in, retire water rights on some of their lands, and get paid over a 14 to 15 year period to stop that use and put those lands back into some sort of a dry land grass crop. We won't be in charge of the cropping there, but that'll be something that the feds will take care of through NRCS. Voluntary agreements. So our statutes provide an opportunity for groundwater users within the same reservoir system there to enter into voluntary agreements. There's no rules. It's a very open-ended statute. So we're working internally and with the Harney RAC process. We will be working with them to talk about these voluntary agreements and how those might work. There could be regulatory curtailment through the critical groundwater area process. And then a little bit different than actually reducing use would be looking for alternative sources, which in some basins aren't a very good option. Or looking to slow the rate of decline or actually store probably surface water through some sort of an aquifer recharge project or ASR project. And again, those are not going to be available statewide, just depending on source water availability for those types of projects here. Next slide. Again, another simple graphic to help the commission kind of understand visually some of these concepts here. A couple of general statements. Starting sooner on groundwater use reductions is going to help maintain groundwater levels. And another general statement is that reducing use significantly early in the process will also help maintain groundwater levels. Now, the flip of that are those social and economic impacts to the groundwater user community out there, where rapid and significant reductions in groundwater use are going to have a very big and meaningful impact on their business operations in that particular basin. So what you're looking at here, trying to see here, what am I thinking? The blue line, again, we've got a kind of a example hydrograph here, depth to water on the vertical axis. The time scale is another 20-year time scale from 2024 to 2044. The blue line is just a decline rate of 5 feet per year. So it's gone down 100 feet over the 20-year period of time. The uppermost blue line is, sorry, the green line there. After 5 years of no curtailment, we went straight to the permissible total withdrawal in that area. And so unrealistically, we immediately attained zero decline, and you've got dynamically stable equilibrium for the remainder of that time period. And that's that horizontal line you're looking at there with kind of the light green color. The brown line is a 5% reduction in groundwater use per year until we get to the PTW. And then the blue line doubles that reduction rate. So it's a 10% reduction. So in about 10 years, you've gotten to your permissible total withdrawal volume there to get to a decline rate of zero. Last slide. So just covering next steps, there's a lot of additional details to work out. We're continuing the Division 512 rules update. We've got our next RAC meeting in Burns near the end of November, and I'm sure there will be several more early next year. We need to continue to evaluate criterion options for the voluntary agreements. We'll continue providing updates to the Water Resources Commission and having discussions with them about these various reductions in use options. And then I just wanted to touch, I think enhanced long-term aquifer monitoring is really going to be part of this. We've got to manage this resource statewide. Justin and the groundwater section are moving forward as quickly as they can to expand our Obswell network out there, get more wells drilled and instrumented, and doing that strategically. And that's going to help us as we move forward. So that's what I've got. Happy to take questions and interested in all of your input on this.
Wow. Go ahead. No, I was just gonna say I was a bit of a fire hose.
Justin only gave me 30 minutes.
Yeah, well, it was worthwhile. So, yeah, I definitely think we should make some comments or so.
Well, one of the comments I'd like to make is, can we just go back to those slides, Justin, and get that all?
Yeah, we can. I apologize. So let me see if I can do this efficiently. Hey, which one did you want to see?
Let's start with the one you had there on Wilsonville water levels.
Okay, up to the top.
As everybody knows, for a long time, I've been, really pushing for aquifer storage and recovery and some proactive measures on groundwater. This is a perfect example of getting away from groundwater, going to surface water. And then if we could go to the one that you had for, the Deschutes, Lake Billy Chinook. And you see what happened when they started that dam and they started setting up storage and recovery. You see all the decline, the increase in water levels and everything else, giving this whole area an opportunity to keep growing and farming and raising crops. But this is a perfect example of aquifer storage, basically surface water and storage of seeds into the aquifers. We have another slide where the blue triangles were that show the decline, larger
Statewide, yeah.
right there. Okay, it seems to me like the most of those up there are right around the Columbia River, flows right through our upper north part of the state. And then we have the Willamette River coming down where you see those coming down the Willamette Valley. A perfect example. I mean, I really don't think the Columbia River is over appropriated, is it? I mean, we got all this water running out to the ocean where we could be storing it. A perfect example is Tyler Hansel's. When he set up to take in the groundwater and doing just aquifer storage up there. And that, are you familiar with that? Mm-hmm. Okay, perfect example. And it seems to me that we'd start doing more aquifer storage recovery. And you keep talking about protecting the senior water right users. If you go back into history, it seems to me like most of the senior water rights that they're under were given more water than they actually needed to use. Okay. So that might be a good step, is to see how much you actually need. Okay, and how much are you using, how much you actually need to tell this. Oh, that's just a few of the things that I wanted to bring up. And we could be in a more proactive move and instead of like we are right now in a reactive move. Because now we're trying to figure out what are we gonna do with what we got? How do we get where we are? Where we were a little bit more proactive, 20, 30 years ago by doing this, we wouldn't be in this situation, I don't personally think. So,
Floyd, I appreciate you bringing that up. From the sense that Justin and his staff are very busy dealing with the problems of today. We've been very reactive in this agency for my whole career here. We've gotten a lot of new staff and they're churning out some amazing work and we're starting to be able to get ahead in some arenas. But back to the groundwater allocation, if we continue on the same path that we're on, that will get covered in blue triangles. And our staff at the agency will be reactive and continue to be reactive to emergencies, crises, wells going dry, cities going dry, all kinds of problems. And so that's what we're trying to get ahead of so we can focus more on real solutions that are going to help stabilize some of these water supplies for some of these communities. Some communities don't have many options, and that's unfortunate. Proximity to the Columbia, I think you're right. There are probably options and opportunities there. They're not easy, but at least there's some hope for some chances. Some of these internally drained basins like Harney, the surface water supply is over appropriated by 2 or 3-fold. And so there's not even wintertime water available with the rare exception of a flood year for those folks either there. So it is a challenge, but it's a good point that you make.
Well, I'd also like to say in the last 32, 33 years that I've been on different advisory groups and worked with the department and watched the department has grown in more proactive than what they were when I first started. So, I mean, I'm not trying to take anything away from what you guys do. I'm just trying to say if we would have been more proactive in the past, and if we could be more proactive with more aquifer storage and recovery areas. I realize there's some areas that aren't going to work, but there's an awful lot of areas, especially around the Columbia River and the Willamette Valley, that can be recharged.
If I could say something to kind of go along with what he was talking about on different things, and I'm going to talk mainly about the Klamath Basin here. And some of you see those triangles right down there. They're basically right down there alongside Tule Lake or TID. And the water back in history before the project and even mostly after the project, the surface water, there was a lot of the surface water stayed in this basin before the project. I mean, we had three huge lakes around here. There wasn't actually that much of that water went down that Klamath River. And now all of a sudden we got a huge amount of it going down the Klamath River. We have less water for the project. And that is why those wells are declining. 100% why they're declining is we are not getting the surface water into this project like it's always been in history. And so I think that is something we need to work on somehow to, I mean, those spots are because of the TID wells. And if we make sure TID gets their surface water, they will quit using their groundwater and those spots will disappear and that groundwater will come back up. And that is something we need to work on.
Thanks, Ken.
Well, I'll chime in since Richard left us here. To Floyd's point on ASR, is it within the realm of possibility that ASR in the right basin could be considered as part of a strategy in implementing a critical groundwater area? To manage it?
Yeah, for sure.
I think it's a good point.
I wish we had more opportunities like some of the more arid states, with the coarse alluvial fans where they could just do AR and spread wintertime water out in the winter on the fields and get aquifer recharge that way. Ours seems to be, Floyd, as you pointed out, a lot of those blue triangles to the north and in the Willamette are Columbia River basalts. And so those are, we're going to have to do ASR on those for the most part. And we are working with Corps of Engineers now, probably looking to do some ASR, try and chase a grant for feasibility study work for the Walla Walla Basin. We'll be working with the Department of Ecology on that. But I think it does, we want to look at all of the tools available to us, a combination of reducing groundwater use and enhancing some sort of recharge to the aquifer system is going to help ease that transition. We just, it'll be more applicable in basins where we have a surface water supply, mostly winter water. And that's a good chunk of Oregon, so.
I've got a couple of questions and comments, but I wanted to see if any other committee members, Phil, in particular, do you have anything you want to ask or chime in with?
No, I appreciate the conversation. I think having a large institutional program that promotes artificial recharge, whether it's AR or ASR, to prop up the water levels and maintain sustainable use, I think that's necessary. Other states are a little bit ahead of Oregon in doing that. Oregon has a really good feasibility study program. Other states are a little bit past that and actually fund projects. Washington State does, and some of the drier states do. But yeah, no, I think that, and we've seen it. You've seen some pretty big successes in the state where water levels were declining regionally around Pendleton before they got their 3 or 4 wells going, and depending on who you talk to, they're either stabilized or maybe even bumped up a little bit. I'm not sure. Walla Walla had quite a bit of success doing the same thing with several of their wells where, water levels declined hundreds of feet. And in some area, they're sort of returned to historic levels. So, like moving towards a program where the state is actively helping pursue federal funds and administering federal funds to find solutions where you can find winter water that's available for storage. I just think that's wise. I've been talking to Ivan about that off and on for probably 10 years. So that's all I have.
Thanks, Phil.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, go ahead, Richard.
Couple of things, I live in the Cooper Mountain Critical Groundwater area. And I was there when that was instituted. It was really, really needed. There were, the municipalities were one of the biggest reasons of decline in that area at the time. I'm wondering if we couldn't get a little clearer picture, particularly like in Harney. If we didn't go ahead and institute metering requirements for the large users as soon as possible, so that we really did have a handle on volume of usage rather than depending on satellite data. I think it would be a lot more accurate. And if it's going to be a critical groundwater area anyway, I am assuming that metering is going to be demanded at that point in time anyway. So if we could move ahead with that earlier rather than later, I think it would help clarify the picture a bit. Maybe even save a lot of time and energy trying to extrapolate from the satellite data.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, I can touch on that really quickly. Our plan is to incorporate a serious water management problem area into the Harney rule process. And that will, I'm going to strategically require metering and water use reporting. By strategically, I think operationally, we're going to have to kind of phase it in. We'll probably take the sub area with the worst rate of decline, maybe the 2 or 3 sub areas with the worst rates of decline. We'll get meters put on those. We have, I forget, 800 or 1,200 wells in the basin down there, irrigation wells that need to be metered. So my water master staff down there can only work with so many users at a time and get compliance. And so we're going to have to phase it in, not just do it all at once. But I think that's going to be the long-term goal, is a lot better measuring and reporting of water use, if not across the whole critical area, and I mean groundwater use, then at least in these sub areas where we're actively doing reductions in use, so we can track that a lot more carefully. So
another sub point, and I don't know whether it's even legal or not, but when a water right is transferred, the allocation, the total allocation is transferred with it. One just happened that I was involved with in my area where the allocation was for X acre feet per year. The long-term initial allocated user never used anywhere near the amount that was allocated. Why should that total allocation go to the transferee when historically it can be proven that X amount has been used over the last 20 years? That should be the amount that's transferred, not the original allocation.
yeah. So what you're talking about is a shift in our transfer process to transfer the consumptive use portion of
Yes.
water versus the pay for water right.
Yes.
And it's been discussed. It would be highly controversial.
Granted.
Yep. But it may be a window into what the future looks like for modernization of transfers, because updating our transfer process is coming soon as well. We need to do that for a number of reasons.
Well, it seems to me that would be one of the most painless ways to reduce the total allocation, because at that window in time, it's not hurting anyone.
Or this instance you were referring to, was that a water right transfer or a sale of property?
Yes,
I mean, but somebody just sold the property.
and it was
Okay.
transferred to
Yeah, of
another
course,
well.
yeah, okay, so it's a little different than a water rights. There's another, water right transfer.
Well, but it was,
Yeah. I get it, so, but I just wanted to clear that in my mind.
to me, it seems like it's almost a painless proposition, because nobody's being hurt in production.
And just to be clear, that I wanna clarify, there was a transfer from one property to another.
Oh,
that
okay,
was Some
okay.
distance away.
Gotcha, okay, so it was both.
As far as your metering, I think it's gonna be a real tough battle to get some of these senior water rights to put a meter on your well. Some are gonna have those refused. But it's not cheap to tear your system apart and put a meter on it and redo your system. Perhaps looking for grants and volunteers to start doing that. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that are willing to volunteer to do that. You're gonna find out there that you're gonna find people that are not gonna want you on their property, don't want you to, they got their water rights, they don't wanna lose any of them. But the metering, if you could get a program where you could, get some funding to help them do that, that might be beneficial to the department to get more data on that asset.
Yeah, no, I agree, Floyd. Couple comments. One of the few clear areas in statute is around metering. And they just updated the statutes where we can require reporting of water use as well outside of a swamp. So we do have the tools, and if they don't comply, we can shut them off legally. And we're sitting on $1 million of ARPA funds to cost share. So we've got that lined up and ready to go. We do need to get that rolling quickly because those funds have a short lifespan on them as well. So we're going to be working towards that as efficiently as we can.
I was involved in this same conversation in about 1986.
Marshall, don't be ringing us.
I know I don't look that old. So, I mean, I'm dead serious. And you called it, it's just like,
Yeah.
and plus you failed to mention, they're finicky and oftentimes don't work right. Flow meters.
Right.
Okay, so I have just a couple thoughts, and I know we gotta move this on, we're a little behind schedule and, you mentioned targeting, you mentioned water level trends, PTWs and sort of volume and timing. In terms of water level trends, I mean, ideally a new equilibrium would be perfect, or, a good goal. Looking back to the Wilsonville example, throttling, that's sort of based on the assumption that everybody can live with the new status quo. I'm wondering if there is the possibility, and I'm not recommending anything here, that the department in collaboration with the local community could say, we'd really like to bring these back up to, reduce that decline and have an equilibrium that is more appropriate for the vast majority of existing wells, for example. If there are a bunch of wells that are sort of like really threatened from a decline. The other thing is, you brought up, so that's one thing. Can recovery be part of sort of target in managing water levels? The other thing, you mentioned, you brought up the question of whether these should be basin specific or statewide. It seems to me that aquifers are so variable, and in terms of their physical dimensions and behavior, and characteristics, that it's really going to vary. A decline that might be acceptable in one system might be totally unacceptable in another system. So it seems that it almost can't be a statewide thing, but it has to be on sort of a basin by basin level or a sub basin by basin level. In terms of the what was the term, permissible total withdrawal, in that, if you brought up three options: a hydrograph approach, a pumping rate versus decline rate analysis, which to me is kind of the same as a hydrograph approach. You're looking at water level data, and the only way you can really interpret that is in the context of what the withdrawal is. So, and then you mentioned a numerical model simulation, kind of a modeling approach. And, as somebody who's done a lot of modeling, I'm all about models, man, but you can't build a model unless you've already done the hydrograph approach and the pumping rate and decline analysis approach, because you need those data and you need to have your mind around those before you can even build a model that you would have any that would be reliable enough to make any decisions based on. So it seems to me your options aren't really options like pick one, they are a suite of tools that you're gonna need to use. So I would change that heading.
Okay.
Here's the tools we're gonna use. And it seems to me, you know, you could do 99% of what you need to do with an empirical approach based strictly on data. You know, and that's gonna be the most bulletproof, defensible thing you can do. But the model might, as you head into it, what a model would be useful for is sort of being able to sort of have some expectations or test your assumptions, you know, okay, we're gonna do this based on all these data and we're assuming this is what's gonna happen. A model could give you some bead on how good you're doing. And that, to me, that's how I think of it. It's another tool in a suite of tools you're gonna be used, but it's not an option without these other parts. So I'm just kind of riffing here. Just trying to fill in gaps in the way that I've sort of perceived you're thinking about it from your talk. Okay, oh yeah, and both the trends and the permissible total withdrawal, you know, there are other conditions that influence water level trends. You know, there's drought cycles, and then there are longer term secular trends brought out by that are probably going to come down the road with climate change. And although we don't know, I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty in climate models about sort of what the precipitation looks like. There's huge certainty in that it's going to get warmer. ET is going to go up, and recharge patterns are clearly going to change. So it's going to be different things in different places. But regardless, that climate influence is out there and somehow needs to be kept in our minds as or in your minds. I'm done with this after today, right? But I mean, seriously, you know, it's an important consideration, and it has to be somehow, at least in the room somehow. I'm not sure the best way to do that, but it's going to be part of what we're all going to be dealing with. My last comments have to do with meeting the requirements. And how you do that, and it seems you talked about the volume and timing of groundwater use, but a big part of it is the spatial distribution of that too, and so that needs to be, that's another big part of that whole decision-making process. And I know you alluded to it early on, and you even used the term granularity. But when I look at the Harney, I see you know, from my little knowledge of that is that there are these bullseyes, and I'm guessing that there are a handful of wells that are driving a lot of that. So you could probably get, you know, fairly specific and find the throttle back, you know, pumping and not, you know, have to do something.
Yeah.
Based on you're on top of that. I just wanted to make sure.
Our approach
Yeah.
there is kind of the concept of sub areas. And
Right.
so Dark and Jerry are working hard on what are the criteria to establish a sub area within the critical groundwater area.
Yeah.
And those are the discussions that we had at the last Rule Advisory Committee meeting, and we'll wrap up at this new one. And they've put a lot of thought into that, but that sub area concept is grouping these users into groups that are in the same portion of the aquifer system. Water level trends are similar, decline rates are similar, you know, and also kind of looking forward, it looks like reductions in use from this group of wells would have the desired response without impacting people unnecessarily.
Yeah, you could get 90% of the impact and 10% of the wells.
But good comment.
Yeah, anyway, these are just things that are probably in your mind, but you want to make sure that you communicate, I guess, and also make the fonts bigger on your graphs. Okay, the last thing I want to leave you with is
Ben, I'll need some help with that.
you mentioned Yeah, I don't know how the rest of you are, but I couldn't see those. You mentioned the heartache and sort of the hardship that you know, these sorts of things can put on communities. And I want to reiterate the term that our former colleague on this committee, Mark Owens, used the term of art of generational glide path. And I think that should be embodied in statute. It was a great idea that you know, and I think you guys are sensitive to the need to sort of like, we've got to kind of do this slowly or do this in a way that's not going to just really cause problems for people. And his term generational glide path to get them to where they want to be was, I thought, a really good one. Anyway, those are my comments and questions. So does anybody else on the committee have questions?
If I could say one more thing, Marshall,
Yeah, go ahead.
it kind of goes back to what you were saying also on whether you would want to do this statewide, basin-wide, or sub-basin-wide. And I do think it should be, I definitely agree with the sub-basin part, because I've seen that down here, just different spots of the basins, of this Klamath Basin's doing fine and other parts are not. So I think keeping it sub-basin is very important. So.
Thanks, Ken.
Yeah.
Are you taking comments from people who are not on the committee right now?
Dustin, you're okay with time?
Well, I'll leave the time up to the committee. We are likely to go longer than 10:30, and I'm not sure what committee members have.
Can you potentially hold it until our public comment period so we can get Jason through? Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, we'll get you here. So let's go ahead and move along to agenda item D. We're about 40 minutes behind schedule, and I don't know who came up with this schedule, but it wasn't very realistic. Now that I think about it.
That was me.
So anyway, so yeah, go ahead. You have
Okay.
you have negative 1 hour.
Negative 1 hour, all right, sounds good. And I just want to note that I see Ken Dearly's comment there in the chat as well, so we can come back to that. We talked a bit about climate fluctuation, but yeah, understood. Okay, so let me share the screen with everybody here again. And meant to say at the very beginning, and we got off to a good start, so I held it, but I'll say it now. Both what Ivan presented and what I'm going to present are still in draft and intended to be continually updated up until the commission meeting. We're both presenting Friday morning, so if folks want to tune back in, that's where we'll be and be having those conversations with the commission. But we've got basically a full half day to talk about these two things. So I did have a smaller amount of time for this group, but I really appreciate everybody's input, and I think that's great as long as we're able to go. So if people do have timing impacts, I understand. And one other thing I should say is on this allocation piece, last time we spoke, we were talking about a timeline in which we would be in the public comment period right now, and we have a 90-day public comment period planned. So last time we met, we were talking about going through the rule language. I know, Marshall, that was a goal of yours. This presentation does touch on some of the major rule language, but not all the rule language. So I want to preface that up front, and I'll kind of collapse this down to focus on that part with this group to get input. And I want to say we have 2 more RAC meetings planned in December and January, so conversation will continue. We expect the public comment period to be now in the spring of next year, and we'll plan to get the next iteration of the committee up to speed and working on this for the committee's input at that point. So still looking for committee input, but at this point, it's not like within public comment period that goes into that Secretary of State record. But this is a good time to continue our discussion and continue getting input that'll shape the potential way that the rules are look.
Can I have a quick question?
Yeah, go ahead.
So the comments that we've made as members here
Yeah.
are they presented to the commission when you make your commission report? Or is it your findings, what you guys have said there? I mean,
Yeah.
Marshall brought up a tremendous amount of good points, you know, and
Yep.
I would like to hope that you would consider the few points that I brought up, but are they presented to the commission when you make your commission report?
Yeah, I'll discuss, more generally with the commission that we presented to GWAC this week, and these were some of the comments that we heard. Frankly, from some of what you guys said, I'm actually gonna change the presentation to Justin's point. You know, this was kind of a dry run for me. I'll update the presentation, try and get some more clarity around some of the things that I had to speak to, and hopefully have a better presentation that'll get to what we want to talk about with the commission there. But this is at least my talk, and the groundwater application. It's work in progress. You know, the commission's going to be hearing about this for several more meetings, so.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I guess from my perspective, I always appreciate these discussions, and just like Ivan said, I take this input and I've got good notes. Ben's been taking notes, and we use it as we craft the rules. I mention bits and pieces to the commission when they come up. And I present whenever you guys make a motion and we wordsmith that out and you vote on it, I present that verbatim and that goes into the record. So if you felt like you wanted to relay something to the commission on Friday and you wanted to do that as a committee and vote on it, then happy to do that. And I will insert that into this slideshow. If you want to hold off, like we did for the critical groundwater area rules, and provide that during the public comment period, and then that also went into the whole packet to the commission when they adopted those rules with your recommendations for what that looked like. So that makes sense on how it's like, it's less formal now unless you make a formal motion, and then I'll put that in verbatim.
So if we made a motion that we wanted Marshall Gannon's questions presented to the commission, they would be presented to the commission.
Yeah, that's how I interpret the statutory purpose of this body, to advise the commission on any groundwater related rules. And as we're going through the rulemaking, we can do that.
Well, I trust Ivan was taking good notes, and it's probably not necessary, but it was all pretty common sense stuff that was sort of filling in gaps more than any major change in the way of thinking. So I'm personally comfortable that these guys will flesh things out. You have more time with the commission than you do here, right? So.
Yeah, I'll have an hour, so it'll be, and I'm trying to, I guess, plant the seeds for a lot of back and forth with the commissioners. I don't expect any decisions from them. What I want to do is get these concepts, the seeds planted in their minds about decline rates, the negative impact of decline rates, the benefits of stopping decline rates, but the cost associated with that. I also hope to go into more discussion with them about the voluntary agreements. There's not a lot we can talk about there because the statutes don't provide us any guidance on that. But I think that potentially is going to be a very important tool, particularly for parts of a critical area that aren't in the worst decline rates. There may be some incentives there, real incentives for folks to just voluntarily curtail their use to some extent, so they don't become an area where we need to step in with a regulatory process on that. So.
Okay. Just one other consideration before I jump in. I want to bring this back to the public comment. Erroneously, I did have it on the agenda at 10:30 if people were on expecting roughly 10:30, do we want to take a pause in what I'm presenting to?
Yeah,
or-
I think
yeah, or-
that's fair. It was also, you know, I can't see the computer screen, so I couldn't see. Greg,
Yeah.
you had your hand up.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that's fair enough. That's a
Okay.
it would be a good move. So Greg, do you wanna, bring up your questions or comments related to, Ivan's presentation?
Yeah, sure. I could, I've got a few things here. I guess I just wanted to throw out there. I'll try to make this quick. I mean, obviously, I think it should be clear to everyone that we can't do nothing. But I guess, I mean, I feel like completely shutting off, well, this goes more to groundwater allocation, but shutting off new groundwater allocations throughout the state, I don't think is the answer everywhere in the state. So, you know, while we're working on groundwater allocation and we're working on, you know, kind of figuring out how we can address areas where we have serious water level declines, you know, like the Harney Basin and so forth. We also, I think, need to be working on developing ways to better use the resources that we have at hand, you know, such as opening the door for more ASR projects, making it easier to do water right transfers, maybe developing programs for, I mean, and I hesitate to use this word, spreading water rights. I've got several clients who, you know, they would like to be able to use their existing water rights to irrigate ground that they have acquired that's adjacent to where they have water rights. And I just say, well, you know, I mean, spreading water is a dirty word with the Water Resources Department. But if they could somehow, because they're using their water more efficiently on their existing ground, spread it out without using any more water than they have been, then there's no harm to the resource, and this benefits, you know, the farmer and the ability to expand our capacity to grow more food. I think we also need to, you know, I think there's just a lot of things that we could do to make things a little bit more user friendly. ASR right now, it's cost prohibitive to get through the bureaucracy and all the costs for the analytical and everything for an individual farmer to do it. It's just, it's really almost just cost prohibitive. I mean, we just recently started working on a project where we have a small housing development. They've got a spring that they could use that you know, that's part of their treatment system. So, you know, they actually, you know, they're sampling this water and using it to provide to their residents from the spring. They also have a couple of wells, but their aquifer is showing severe water level declines. And we thought, hey, they're set up, they're perfect, kind of a turnkey system here. They could use their spring to discharge into their wells to help their aquifer recover. But even though they're meeting drinking water standards, you know, to deliver to their clients, they're not meeting the sampling and analysis requirements that they'd have to do for an ASR project. And the cost of doing that would be prohibitive. So, I mean, you know, it's a perfect opportunity, but we can't go forward with it because the costs are just ridiculous. The analytical requirements are, I think, unrealistic and unreasonable. That's just one example. And I probably should I'm kind of rambling on here, but these are some of my thoughts. Another big elephant in the room here that nobody's talking about, and I guess I'd like to refer back to that map with all the triangles on it showing wells with excessively declining water levels. And I think Ivan mentioned that in the Willamette Valley, most of those wells were in the basalts. Well, I guess one of the things that we need to talk about is commingling wells. You know, how many of those wells that are showing excessive declines are commingling wells? And not, so, you know, how much of the problem is commingling and how much of it is actual, you know, water overuse or overdraft? And we don't know. We can't, it's hard to parse that out, but I haven't heard a single mention of commingling wells in any of this discussion. And I think that's something that we need to be looking at in every place where we see excessive water level declines, especially in the basalts and other volcanics. You know, you got to look at that and say, well, hey, is part of this problem, maybe most of the problem, from a commingling well? And I haven't heard no discussion about that at all. So, I mean, I think that's something that needs to be addressed. I know it's an uncomfortable, problem. It's a difficult subject, but we need to talk about it. And that's about all I've got right now.
Thanks, Greg.
Yeah, thank you. And that commingling wells is an issue. I know my colleague Ken Light has worked a lot in CRB, pulls his hair out over that one quite a bit. And has done a lot to get a lot of wells reconstructed and solve some problems. So, okay, so any other public comment mainly related to what Ivan said, and then we'll open it back up again when Justin's done. Okay, good. Justin.
One quick comment in the chat here from Ken Beerley. Do you anticipate setting permissible total withdrawal with climate fluctuation?
Got that, Ken. Thank you.
Right. Okay.
Was it, you didn't answer the question though.
Was it a question or was it a
Question?
Oh,
Question.
do you
Sorry.
anticipate?
Yeah.
I thought it was a statement, Ken. Apologies. Yeah, we'll try and factor that in. And I think that's where something like a numerical flow model could help us run some forward-looking scenarios. You know, we have a number of basins where obviously some of the background water level decline is a function of climate as well as use, and trying to parse those two out can be challenging.
Okay, so I'm gonna get going. I want to recognize it's 10:30, so we're gonna go over. If folks need to drop off or take off, I understand. If you want to make comments that, you know, and aren't able to hear, if you email them in, I can forward to the rest of the group, and make sure let's get down. And as I say, the conversation will continue into next year's GWAC session, so there'll be more chances. All right, so I'm gonna get this.
How long do you anticipate going with your, just for the group?
Well, I had anticipated a half hour of presentation and a half hour of conversation. I will skim through most of these slides because they've been presented to GWAC and we've been kind of up to speed over the last few years. So I will do my best to go as quick as possible. And I guess how long we want to spend on the rule language will be up to.
I was just trying to give folks an idea. I'm not trying to rush it.
Yeah, no. And I will both try and be as brief as possible and leave as much room as we can for folks' time. So, okay, so I'm just going to skim through a number of slides because again, this is intended to be we got 2 hours on the agenda with the commission. So we're hoping to have a good discussion and answer questions. So starting out with the objective, which you've seen before, noting that this is addressing some of the recommended actions in the integrated water resources strategy. Overall, wanted to revisit the rulemaking need, talk about the process, talk about the RAC and public, and I should put GWAC input to date. Statutory framework, we'll start out with, and then I'm planning to spend most of our time looking at the language for these two key items that we are proposing to change in rule. Defining reasonably stable groundwater level. Again, that's a statutory policy statement that has not been defined to date. And proposed changes to how we determine the potential for substantial interference in order to meet those objectives that we just saw. We have a pretty robust section on options to meet future water needs. So this goes to some of the comments that Greg made. We've got a number of existing options to meet needs. I will likely skip that part with this committee unless you ask me otherwise. But I'll just say it's there, and we can go through it if you guys feel like that's a good thing to do when we get there. So rulemaking need, I'll breeze through this really fast. Just want to note that surface water is allocated in much of the state and has been for some time. This map shows, you know, just the most senior water date or priority date to which some stream in these administrative basins is regulated back to. So east side of the state, 1800s or time immemorial. Same with the Southwest, and then the wetter Willamette Valley and coast to the 1950s, 60s, 70s, I guess, on the North Coast. So some, you know, streams get regulated back to very early times, and we, I think through the prior appropriation system and as it asks us to do, we keep on appropriating and then we regulate back in times of shortage. So that's how Western water law has been intended to work since the 1800s. And where that has a nexus with our rulemaking is that we haven't historically taken into account the full impacts of groundwater that forms base flow for many of these streams as we're proposing to do now. So I have a couple examples that I'm going to skip through again for this group, basically just saying for an example on the west side, an example on the east side, how groundwater flow contributes to base flow, how those streams are fully allocated and over allocated because the water masters regulate back most years in the Eagle Creek example, every year on the Rock Creek example, and the Rock Creek example goes back to curtailing to the 1860s. In both those cases, we've issued water rights as recently, groundwater rights as recently as 2005 that are likely to continue to impact these streams, but because of our current PSI standards are allowed because they don't form an acute impact. However, we know that it's not a matter of when, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So even though they don't have an acute impact, they're likely to, well, our generally accepted hydrogeologic understanding is they will impact that stream base flow up to the full amount, given enough time. And so we're continuing to nick away at these streams that are already being regulated back for senior surface water users, and they rely on that base flow. And that's really the mindset change that we're proposing with these rules. Also have dry wells or domestic wells that are going dry, and other water wells for that matter. I've been mentioned the dry well complaints. The state has propped up a number of state and local governments have put forward programs to help folks deal with dry wells. Based on OWRD's program, the WARF Fund, our average cost to deepen or replace a well is about $26,000. And therefore looking at risk for water wells across the state, up to 13,000 wells based on well log data are completed 25 feet or less below the reported static water level, and 50,000-ish wells have a total completed depth that's 50 feet or less below the reported static water level. So while we don't expect water levels to decline by 25 feet or 50 feet all across the state, this just gives an overall risk of kind of how vulnerable or how many vulnerable wells we have, and it really depends on where these wells are for what's actually going to happen. This gives some indication of how many wells are in each county that would be expected to go dry if we have a 50-foot decline. 50 feet again is our threshold for excessively declined water levels. So you can see where they're kind of clustered, and so the yellows are tens to hundreds of wells, orange is hundreds to thousands of wells, and the red are 3,000 plus wells that are completed less than 50 feet below the reported static water level. And then I've shown this plot a lot. Just want to use this to say that there are a lot of exempt use wells that are drilled for mostly domestic, but also stock, industrial, other purposes that do not require a permit. They're about 90% of all wells drilled since 1955 that we have well log records for. They account for about 5% of total groundwater use based on 2015 estimates. Permitted wells are larger capacity wells, mostly irrigation, also community, which is municipal and quasi-municipal, accounts for about 10% of the wells drilled since 55 and about 95% of water use. So our allocation rule proposed language, first of all, won't affect any of these wells. And in the future, they will affect the, roughly 10% of wells that use the most water. They will not affect exempt use wells. So just want to use this slide to kind of describe what the allocation process will and won't affect. And again, this is future looking water rights. This rulemaking isn't going to affect existing water rights or future exempt use wells. So just want to make sure that we lay out for the commission all of the public involvement that's gone into these rules, including we've got GWAC engagement up there. I'll need to update that to 8 meetings for Friday. But we've been trying to discuss this and make this accessible to as many people as we can. We've done a lot of additional presentations. RAC is relatively large and diverse, 30 members, representatives from a whole host of entities. Did our best to get as many user groups in there as we could. And with respect to our public input, we will spend more time to go through kind of general feedback with the commission. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over this unless somebody raises their hand and says, please talk about it. Okay. So, lots of feedback, and we've endeavored to provide, to acknowledge all that feedback, to document it, to give one set of responses in rack number 4 to a large list of feedback and kind of why we, how we incorporated it or why we chose not to. So, all right. So the meat of what I want to talk with this group about is some of the actual language and rule changes. So first of all, I want to make sure that we recognize that all rule changes have to be implementing statute. This is the statutory reference for what we call the 4-part test for whether a proposed allocation is within the public interest or not. And we're focused only on one component of this 4-part test, which is water is available. So the rules that define what water is available means are where we're focusing for this rulemaking process. And to give a general overview, the current rules say water is available if the groundwater source is not over allocated. And it goes on to further define what over allocated means. But the point is that the current rules have us allocate up until a state of over allocation, and then we stop allocating new rights at the same time that we need to address the over allocation. So we make it worse, if you will, right up until the point that we have to start curtailing people back. And the new rules set up different set of criteria that say requested source is available only if these 3 bullets, I'm gonna focus on those top 2, water levels are reasonably stable and hydraulically connected surface water is available. This aquifer can likely produce at the requested rate is something that we assess anyway, and we just made it specific in the rules. And so this is how it looks in the actual rule set. And now I'm conscious of my text size. So I'll just say we've taken this definition of water is available. The surface water components remain the same, and we've tried to not affect anything. We want to leave everything working the same except what we're working on, and we've been careful about doing that. So essentially, in this definition, water is available, we say the requested groundwater source exhibits reasonably stable water levels as defined in Division 8, and we'll go look at what that definition is. And then E is the proposed groundwater use will not substantially interfere with existing rights. And that's per the definition of substantial interference in Division 8, as well as the rules governing groundwater interference with surface water in Division 9. So I'll also share those specific rules, but basically up front, what is water is available? It gives the criteria and it gives where the further definitions are, and then we need to move on to other areas of the rules to find those further definitions. I'm only going to present some key rulemaking highlights here, and I want to just make sure to say that what I'm presenting is not all the rule changes. So there's a number of kind of minor definition changes we've made. We've aligned the definitions across divisions. So we've done some work. For example, the definition of aquifer was different in 2 divisions. So we made those work the same. We've removed redundant definition components. So sometimes some definitions said essentially the same thing and we consolidated. So substantial interference and overdraw were 2 examples of defined criteria that we've kind of streamlined. And we've edited a number of typos, and we've made groundwater 1 word instead of 2 to align ourselves with the USGS standard from the 90s or whenever that was. So lots of things that I'm not going to present here, and I just want to make sure that I'm clear about that. We have gone through all those details with the RAC. So, okay, so with that, I'm going to move on to reasonably stable water levels, unless there's any questions on the water is available part. Right. So, I believe that I showed this last time. Again, when we went to define this term, we wanted a science-based framework. This plot, I think, describes it well. And this kind of goes to Ken Beerley's comment that we want to define this dynamically stable range for groundwater sustainability up in the blue band there. We recognize that water levels are going to rise and fall seasonally. The spring high water level is going to go up and down in response to climate change, or excuse me, strike that, climate variability. So when we look back at our climate record, we have a relatively pronounced decadal climate cycle as well as shorter El Nino, La Nina cycles. And that's going to mean that our spring highs go up and down. But overall, we want those spring highs to come back up to what they were historically. And that's what we're determining is sustainable use, right? The spring highs should always come back, and we'll pump that down during the summer. After the winter recharge season, we should see those come back, within what the climate is providing for us. So this is some of the criteria we had when we went through our effort to develop a definition. We wanted to accommodate the stable range. We wanted to identify declining levels relatively quickly. We didn't want the definition to flip-flop back and forth, especially in a prior appropriation system. We don't want to say no to one user and then say yes 5 years later as water levels swing back up. So that's another important reason to take dynamically stable into account. And we want to protect against long, slow declines because we have a rate-based test, you'll see, and a magnitude test. So, reasonably stable is really a kind of a change over time, but we also want a threshold criteria that says, well, if we're changing slowly over time, but we're inextricable, we're going down over decades, we also want to protect against that. So we did this through taking a look at a number of hydrographs that respond to different precipitation cycles. So the blue line here is precipitation in inches per year over time. The black line is water levels. In this case, it's Deschutes 3016 near Sisters. So we wanted to take a look at these wells that had some sort of variability in water levels in response to precipitation. So then we looked at the magnitude of the peaks and the troughs to help us determine that dynamically stable range. Here's another example from the Klamath Basin. And essentially, we did that for roughly, well, more than 80 wells, I'll say, across the state. This is their location. So we found wells in most of the purple lines are NOAA climate divisions. So we found wells in most of these climate divisions that appeared to respond mostly to variability in precipitation year on year and weren't affected by pumping or other development, or at least were minimally affected, and looked at the peak to trough on those to define our dynamically stable range. And so in short, what that led to was a definition of half a foot a year declines averaged over 5 to 20 years. So that should capture the historic climate variability durations that we see. And also, again, no more than 25 feet of total decline from highest known. So that in looking at those water level responses peak to trough, 90% of those wells had a variability less than 23 feet. And so we've added a couple feet for a little buffer and called it 25. We've also stated that we need at least 5 years. Well, we need data from 4 of the past 5 years in order to make a determination. So we want enough data to find a trend, and otherwise we're going to say that water's not available until that data is available. Had a number of comments about burden of proof and how that puts the burden on the applicant, and that is still the case. And we've heard those comments and concerns, and right now we think that's still the best way that we can think of to do this. And we put in an option for basin program rules to provide a local definition. Right now, those rules say that definition can be no less stringent than declined excessively. The thought being that a definition of reasonably stable water levels should not be more than the definition for declined excessively. We've also had a lot of pushback on that, and I think that's going to be one of the main things we talk about with the GWAC in December and January, is continuing to discuss what that means. I'll say that there's also areas, I think, where because of the local variation, it's important to select something that's less than 25 feet. Perhaps Fort Rock is a good example of that. Fort Rock was classified as it's a classified area in the late 80s, I think. And essentially we said, hey, we see water levels falling with development. We aren't going to issue any new water rights. Water levels have continued to fall based on the development to date. They're falling at less than half a foot a year, and they haven't reached 25 feet yet. So Fort Rock actually meets the statewide definition, but for that area, by classifying earlier, the senior users have a much longer use path before they meet these excessively declined thresholds than not. And I'll also point out, we've received some comments from conservation groups that essentially in Fort Rock, we've said, well, our plan is to allow our plan. They've stated that what they see the department's plan is as allowing water level declines until Anna Springs dries up. And while Anna Springs won't dry up till, I think, roughly 70 feet of decline, and 50 feet is excessively declined, and theoretically we could use that trigger to do something before that, I think spring flow will decline. You know, I don't think that that's debated. And so how we treat that is to be seen, but that's because that was classified in the 80s. There's a much longer period of time in order to discuss and address that. Okay, so what does that actually look like? So in our Division 8, which is statutory groundwater terms, and you can see, maybe I need to use this pointer. Let's do that. You can see that this is one of the things I talked about, that we've done these little changes to groundwater and made other typos that you'll see in there, but I'm not going to focus on that. So first of all, we needed to define a point at which we were going to compare water levels over time, and that's, we chose the annual high water level. So we defined what that meant as a, you know, highest elevation or shallowest depth since that level existed within a year. So that's the data we're looking at when we look at reasonably stable water levels. Then I'm going to skip to the reasonably stable water levels definition. Again, this is brand new statutory term that hasn't been defined to date. And I'll just run through the major points here. So first of all, no decline or an average rate of decline less than half a foot a year. We talked about that. We talked about the averaging duration of 5 to 20 years. So if today's water level compared to water levels between 5 and 20 years, they have to all be more than half a foot a year. If any one of them shows less than that, in how we looked at things, that means that water levels are probably rising and falling. So if any one of those data points is less than half a foot a year, then it's reasonably stable. I'll make sure that I said that correctly. Yeah, okay. So then B is again this total threshold of compared with the highest known static water level that we've not declined 25 feet or more. And then this continues to say that water level data must be available in the year under evaluation to perform the test. But in the absence of current data, we can look at data that's at least 5 years old. So we want to have current data to make this determination. Sometimes we have wells that have data in the 70s and not since then. And so we would want a current water level to compare to the 70s to make this determination. And so that just, we don't want to make decisions based on decades old data. And C, interesting. If we have an area where we haven't had any development, then we're going to assume that water levels are in equilibrium with the climate. So an example that we've seen before is far southeast Oregon. If there's a new development and we don't have any records of other wells or well development in some radius that the hydrogeologist determines based on the hydrogeologic setting, then, you know, we aren't going to require groundwater level data in that situation. The flip side is perhaps an area south of the Dalles where we know that groundwater levels have been developed. Those water rights are old and don't have reporting conditions. We might not have any data, but we know that development has gone on. And so we're likely to require data in those cases. But we wanted to make sure that this came from, you know, back and forth with the RAC and other organizations to make sure that we had something in place to not require data where it didn't seem reasonable to do so. And then here's this in D, we've got the superseded language. And again, we've currently in the current draft iteration have this this kind of basement on it. And again, we intend that to be a point of further discussion. Okay. And so this is really interesting. Okay, so redefining PSI. So this is the second part. So actually I should pause. I'm sorry. Any comments on the reasonably stable water level language? Okay, so
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
The part of the definition is, you know, having this interannual decline of less, you know, not more than half a foot.
Yeah.
For 5 to 20 years. But then you mentioned that if any year was less than half a foot, then that kind of resets the analysis, but I'm kind of, you know, a little confused between 5 to 20 years and what that means. So if you had 5 years or 6 years of half a foot, the declines that exceed half a foot a year, then that triggers the definition. But if in year 6, the decline was less than half a foot, then it no longer satisfies that condition?
correct. So if water levels are fluctuating up and down, and we're looking back from today to 5 to 20 years ago, if today isn't a low cycle and water levels are coming this way so that it was more than half a foot, more than half a foot, more than half a foot, oh, it's less than half a foot, less than half a foot, or more, less. So that's the
So
intention.
the averaging period could sort of influence, so what happens if you have 22 years of data?
Yeah, well, gotta draw a line somewhere.
Yeah,
That's,
okay.
I mean, yeah. no,
I was just a little curious.
But it's a really good point. I mean, we
I'm
are.
not sure it is a good point.
No, it is, because where you start matters,
Yeah.
right? And a lot of the decisions where we get, you know, hindsight's 20/20 and we are criticized for, well, how could you issue something here when now it's down here? And well, now we know it's down here, but in another case, it might have come back up. And so, and there's also the assumption, right? Like some folks will assume, hey, we have this decadal climate cycle, and so it's going to come back up. And we had to create a quantitative threshold to say, okay, this is going to be our year, and this is how we're going to average it. And it's not perfect. I mean, we've applied the current rules, I think, to all the hydrographs we have, right? And it mostly works, and every once in a while it doesn't. And I want to acknowledge that's the case. It's not perfect in every situation, but in most of the situations, this seems to allow for that climate response variability. So,
And I'm assuming that, or am I correct in assuming that the water levels reported on water well reports are included in that
yes, they are. Yes.
set of data that are used? Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yep. All right. So we're going to move on to redefining PSI. This is the second major part. Again, I've shown all this before, so I'm going to skim through it. Just want to make sure that I reiterate that, you know, groundwater is part of the hydrologic cycle, that when we talk about hydraulic connection, what we mean is that, you know, groundwater can receive, recharge, it's flowing someplace, it's discharging to streams. The circle is the point in this plot where hydraulic connection for the purposes of this discussion takes place. And that if we put a well in along the flow path, then we're pumping water that would otherwise be discharging to support streams. Here's a picture of some springs. And again, if we put a well in where groundwater is flowing toward the spring discharge, we're going to reduce the spring flow. We can move the well back. That will spread out the timing of the impacts, but given enough time, this is our generally accepted hydrogeologic principles, right? In principle, the source of water to wells comes from storage and depletion, and that in a hydraulically connected system, given enough time, we're going to be along this line of water from stream flow depletion with pumping time on the x-axis here and percent of groundwater pumping rate that comes from storage or water level decline versus comes from stream flow depletion or capture of flow that would otherwise go to streams. Given enough time, it's 100%, right? And we want to, these new rules attempt to put that generally accepted hydrogeologic principle into a functional mechanism with respect to allocation and seeing where the impacts lie and when. In some cases, we do have tools for timing. So this is a groundwater flow model example from the Deschutes Basin, where this particular scenario was run with 4 wells located 20 miles from the hydraulically connected point on the stream. And it looked at the stream depletion for Crooked River, Deschutes River, Whitechoose Creek over time. And you can see that this line is the buildup that mirrors, it's not smooth because it's more true to life, or models the heterogeneity in the system. But in this case, in the Deschutes, these 4 wells pumping 1.5 CFS after, and I apologize, this model stress period is in months, but that's about 30 years. And we have more than 80% of that pumping rate is coming from stream flow depletion. So those streams have depleted, more than a CFS after 30 years. So again, under today's rules, we would allow that impact. And the Deschutes, I just want to acknowledge, has a mitigation program to mitigate against this, and this has been known, but this process happens across the state at different timescales. But again, given enough time, pumping from hydraulically connected systems is going to impact surface water, and that surface water is fully allocated. And so essentially, as Greg has pointed out in the past in his role as part of the Rules Advisory Committee and others, these proposed rules mean that for hydraulically connected groundwater availability, we're going to take a look at surface water availability to see if the surface water source can support further allocation. So the rules then look like this. First of all, we've got a definition for hydraulic connection that we went and looked through the literature and found something that we think is a bit more robust. And here's a summary of all the words that I'm going to show you. So current rules say that the potential for substantial interference happens for wells that are 1 mile or closer to a stream, and for impacts that accrue over a pumping season. And it ignores, in function with other policies that have been implemented over the years, it ignores long-term cumulative impacts to these already over-appropriated surface waters. And the proposed rules go to saying that the groundwater source, where it's hydraulically connected with the surface water source, PSI will be determined. So essentially, we're collapsing the water rights term of art, potential for substantial interference, with the scientific concept of hydraulic connection. So we are basically saying we want to look at generally accepted hydrogeologic principles for hydraulically connected wells and understand that over long enough time, pumping from that well is going to be seen in stream flow depletion. And we are then going to look to the Division 8 criteria for substantial interference to look at the surface water availability. So we're going to look at, again, as I just said, water availability. We're going to look at water master regulation history. We're going to look at any rules that might have withdrawn streams for various uses, and make sure that the surface water can accommodate additional impacts from pumping hydraulically connected groundwater. And so I've got a lot of text here, and what I really need to do is go through and highlight some key terms. That's part of the work in progress, but essentially it talks about how we're going to make a hydraulic connection finding, that we're going to use all the information provided in the application and in the public comment period and in the documents that the department has. So we're going to look at any studies in the area. We're going to look at everything the applicant provides. We're going to look at anything that comes in during public comment, take all that information into account. And we've got a list of what best available information may include. And then I'm gonna skip down a little bit to PSI. So essentially, this is what I had just said, that potential for substantial interference will occur if a new proposed groundwater use over the full term of the proposed right will obtain water from stream flow depletion. So for most regular groundwater rights, they're essentially forever, right? I said way up at the top of the presentation, we're curtailing back to 1860s water rights, right? And those 1860s water rights, I think people have no intention of ever letting those go to forfeiture or misuse. So we can assume that when a water right is issued, people are going to exercise it to the maximum amount over time. And so for a normal water right, essentially, we are looking at that forever time period. Now that assessment may be different for time limited applications such as limited licenses and emergency drought use permits. So those will be assessed against the time of those permit durations, but any new application for a permanent right will be assessed against essentially a very long time, or scientifically we call that a steady state endpoint.
Well, I
Go
think
ahead.
I've asked this before, but. So if you're determining now if it has any potential at all to have hydraulically connected to the surface water, which you stated most all water is hydraulically connected. So if that's the situation, you're looking at it for the total life of this, and you're not gonna issue any more permits. If we're going by the criteria that you just mentioned.
Yes, if the surface water body cannot support further allocation. So we'll look to the surface water body, right? I mean, if the majority of impact is to the Willamette River, then perhaps there's water available for further allocation, right? There were some areas in that map I showed where surface water is still available in August, which is about the most limited month. Maybe September is some streams. So I want to say yes and, right? Hydraulic connection is a continuum, and we've had a lot of discussion about the ideal scientific definitions of the source of water to wells and how that works. We also recognize there should be some, human planning perspective, right? And so I don't expect our determination of hydraulic connection to change from how it is today. So for example, Columbia River basalts, we generally find are not hydraulically connected in areas where the wells are deep and cased and sealed deep. And there's exceptions to that. If streams dissect down and intersect interflow zones, we will find hydraulic connection, but for the most part, we don't find hydraulic connection in that setting. And there's other situations that we run into around the state that are similar. So in those cases, we would not find hydraulic connection. And so I'm gonna say, yes, I think in, weighing the whole state as a whole, there's more hydraulically connected aquifers than not, but there's certainly unconnected aquifers. So I don't want to say that's automatic for all proposals all the time. So again, I don't expect the department to make different hydraulic connection findings than we do today. The difference is in what constitutes substantial interference or the potential for substantial interference. So
I think the potential for the interference, but I'm kind of thinking on.
Yeah.
Who's gonna make the determination of potential?
Well, that's, hydrogeologist is gonna make that determination right now. We make it on the current Division 9 rules and the supporting policy documents. And in the, if these rules are promulgated, we'll do it according to these rules.
So, putting that aside, because you're exactly right. And I think that's a defensible assumption, I guess. It all hinges now on the definition of substantial interference, and I think that's where you're hitting, because really, I've said all along, it's about trade-offs, it's about, yeah, we know. And my hat's off to this committee, they had a pretty heavy lift here, just sorting this out. It's about trade-offs, so it's how do you weigh the potential, a really a minuscule long-term impact in the benefit that we get as a society from that versus, how do we manage that trade-off, the benefit we get for potentially minuscule impact to the stream, and that's where the substantial or potentially large impact is. It seems like everything now kind of focuses in on the substantial interference definition. Because that's where you really define.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
What kind of hit are we comfortable with for the streams,
That's right.
Anyway, so carry on. Does that, yeah, go ahead.
For your Division 9 rules, does it state, in the Division 9 rules, does it state anything about distance from a stream?
No. So we've removed the distance criteria.
It did
It does today, yes. In the proposed rules, it does not. So it, in determining hydraulic connection, how about this? The way the rules are written, it says hydraulic connection is a prerequisite for PSI, but doesn't necessarily mean that. Then as we go down, a determination of PSI shall look at the application of these generally accepted hydrogeologic principles. We've laid out 2 examples for folks to, make sure that they know this is what we're looking at, as well as anything else. And again, we're going to look at anything provided by the applicant or commenters or what have you. And basically then here's the definition of PSI, right? A groundwater use is going to cause stream flow depletion based on the assessments we just talked about, and therefore may cause or may have caused substantial interference with surface water, depending on Division 8. So there's a lot of looping in these rules, unfortunately, and we've tried to minimize that and have, I think, succeeded to some degree with help of the RAC and their input, which we appreciate. But we have to go back now to substantial interference. So here's what Marshall was just talking about. So what does this mean? And this looks messy because we took an existing definition and changed it a bit. But basically what we're saying is depletion of a surface water with which groundwater has PSI and the surface water is already over appropriated or is administratively or statutorily withdrawn. It's restrictively classified. If it has surface water rights that have been regulated off due to insufficient supply, or has a minimum perennial stream flow or in-stream right that's unmet. So, and a lot of these say during any period of the year. So, especially as wells get further away from streams, their impacts are spread. So while there might be pumping during the irrigation season, again, with distance, the impacts are going to be distributed over a full year, likely. And we want to look at water availability and regulation over all those months to see if the surface water source can accept that. So when Marshall said there could be a very small impact or a very large impact, it's the proposed rules put that in relation to the stream and whether or not existing users are satisfied. So yes, there's a trade-off for very small impacts. And maybe, we've talked about and considered, should we allow that or not? And right now we do, right? So right now we allow it. But again, it's cumulative. So this water rights impact is in addition to all the neighboring impacts. All the hydraulically connected wells add up to a total impact. And if we have water users with a priority date, surface water users with a priority date of 1970, 1950, 1920, 18, whatever, that aren't being satisfied, under a prior appropriation system, should we be continuing to issue 2024, 2034, whatever water rights that we know are going to continue to impact the streams where senior users are not being satisfied? And that's the big change that we're proposing with these rules, is that we look at the surface water bodies and whether existing water rights are being satisfied before continuing to incrementally nick away at them. So that's the crux of it.
So by taking the restricted limits on Division 9 from, what was it, a quarter mile?
A mile.
Was it a mile?
Yeah.
Okay, making a definite distance?
Yeah.
Basically, it's all potential wells that are in alluvials at risk of having a permit.
Yeah, well, and I should clarify, it's not necessarily indefinite distance. In the hydraulic connection assessment, we'll look at how a proposed use will impact the aquifer and how the cones of depression associated with the wells that are the points of appropriation grow. And they can be truncated by geologic features or by hydrologic features. So if a well cone of depression expands to, if you put a well, I'm going to use the Willamette River because it's easy. If you put a well near the Willamette River and the cone of depression hits the Willamette River, and it'll spread to some degree, but once it's capturing, roughly 100% of its flow from the Willamette, it's not going to grow any further in other directions, right? So we'll take that into account in the spatial distribution, right? So we aren't going to say that a well in Eugene is going to impact Johnson Creek in Portland, for example, right? So there'll be bounds on the hydraulic connection finding from the physical system. Okay, so let's see.
Good thing it's simple.
Yeah, right. So this goes on, and I've got this in here just to say there are other components of substantial interference that we've tried not to alter. So this economic pumping level, we've fixed the typo here. Groundwater to groundwater interference. A lot of controversy about this particular component, but it's not part of the allocation rulemaking, and so we've left that piece as it is. So I only have this slide up here to note that even though there's been some minor editing for typos and groundwater, we haven't changed the function of the rest of that definition. Okay, and then I said that I was going to skip this options to meet water needs. It's 11:15. So I want to pause there. It took me 45 minutes, not 30. I apologize.
That's okay.
But we had good conversation along the way.
It's no wonder the RAC is scheduled 2 additional.
Yeah,
meetings,
yeah. So,
They're all gonna term out too at some point.
yeah.
Yeah. Like-
Justin, there's a slide at the very end with the future timetable. And
Okay.
you might want to see that.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, thank you, Laura. I appreciate that. So, next steps. We've mentioned additional RAC meetings as well as public outreach. Our current anticipated schedule, which I want to acknowledge has changed more than once, is that we'll go to the notice of proposed rulemaking with the Secretary of State in the spring. We'll have a 90-day comment period. We're planning to do multiple public hearings around the state. All will be hybrid. And then currently the plan is to present the final rules to the commission for adoption next summer. So that's where we're headed. All right. With that,
Can I ask one question? I guess I can.
of course.
Any questions? I should,
You raise your hand.
I want to go first. I think this does bear some discussions and I still have time on my parking meter. You did mention options to meet water needs.
Yes,
That's not really part of the rulemaking process. That's just something, when you blew through your slides real quick, I thought I saw ASR and it kind
Yeah.
of brings up some of the stuff Floyd was talking about earlier. I don't know that it really affects the rulemaking, but it probably is really important I'm guessing in a public meeting where people need to realize there are multiple paths forward.
Yeah.
Should a groundwater right, well, to either obtain a water right or otherwise obtain water for specific use. That was my
yes.
question. I wish we had time to go through that, but people want to get out of here. We lost Richard, but does anybody have any questions? I guess Ken or Phil, you guys got any questions?
I got one thing I would like to bring up on this substantial interference to these streams and stuff. And one of the things that I've seen and am seeing down here is these wetlands being put in and being formed. And a lot of these are being formed on agricultural ground. I know of two of them that are, one's on the Williamson, one's on the headwaters of the Sprague. And they're on, like I said, old agricultural ground, but they're not being regulated in any way, shape, or form and being allowed to do whatever they want. We got another one an outfit wants to form another wetlands right down here in the middle of the project. Where is all this water supposed to come, and how come they're not being regulated like ag is?
Ken, I don't know, this is Ivan here. I don't know that that's specific to the groundwater allocation type rules. Maybe what you can do is give me a call sometime and we can talk about the specifics of those. I've heard about like wetland enhancement projects down there. I don't know a lot about the specifics. But we can talk about why they would and wouldn't be subject to regulation depending on different scenarios there.
Well, and I realize that, but I'm just bringing this up because he's talking about interference, and these are interference to these streams. So are these being put in? I mean, are they being affected just like groundwater?
Are you asking if a new constructed wetland would be considered a surface water body that would be considered under the Division 9 review for a new groundwater application? Like a stream would?
All right.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure that we really considered that.
Yeah, so I guess, so two things, and this has been a criticism from some of the folks on the RAC, is that unless the wetland has a water right, it's not going to come up in the list of items that we assess for substantial interference. So those items are either listed in rule based on water master regulation history or are a valid water right. So with respect to even the reasonably stable water levels, we've had folks bring up that, well, some groundwater dependent ecosystems based on springs or seeps, may go dry long before 25 feet of groundwater level decline. And we've had to acknowledge, understood, maybe that's a case where a basin specific rule protects something differently, but under the proposed rules, those, there's some amount of whether it's wetlands or fens or what have you that are impacted, it's some of those are expected to be impacted, and if they don't have a water right, then they aren't going to have I guess a protection. So that might answer, I guess, what Ivan was bringing up. But Ken, what I heard you say is, if a wetland is built, is that impacting stream flow, and is that allowed? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so that's outside this rulemaking, and I guess I would encourage you to follow up with Ivan, because that's a field services question that I can't answer. So
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Yeah, Richard, no other questions from the committee.
I check in with Brandon real quick also.
Yeah, I was gonna open it up. Well, yeah, because I was just pretty much gonna open it up at this point. And get to the folks that aren't on the committee. I guess, why don't we just go ahead and do that, and then that can just merge into our public comment period, if that's okay with folks. So, yeah, go ahead, Brandon.
Or sorry, Brandon, I just wanted to ask if you had anything.
Yeah, do you have any
before we skipped
questions?
on.
No, not at this point.
Okay, I know that Greg is on the RAC committee. Do you have any questions or comments you'd like to add to what either that Justin can answer, or things that you want to make the committee aware of?
Yes, I do. I guess that, I feel like the department's on the right track with the, reasonably stable water levels part of this thing. I mean, it's the rules, the new rules basically is kind of a three-legged stool as I see it. You've got reasonably stable water levels as one leg. You've got within the capacity of the resource as another leg, which is really not that much of an issue. I don't think. You just have to be sure not to ask for more water than wells in the area could be expected to produce. The third leg of the stool, this potential for substantial interference, though, is the one that is going to collapse almost every time, because, and I keep saying this over and over again. I'm probably sounding like I'm a broken record, but and I think by design, if the well is found to be hydraulically connected, which is going to be the case most of the time, and if it's hydraulically connected to streams which are over allocated according to WARS, which is most of the time, then that's going to result in collapse of the third leg of the stool, and then the application will be denied most of the time. And I guess this is where I'm most uncomfortable with these rules. We could have situations, and I see this. I mean, I'm out on the I'm working in the field measuring water levels every year for our clients. We do over 100 water levels every year. And we've been doing some of our clients, we've been measuring water levels for, 20 years probably. And so there are areas, in fact, I would say most of our clients that we're measuring water levels for, we're not seeing excessive water level declines. We're seeing water levels that are within that dynamic stability range. But yet, under the new proposed rules, if we were to, apply for a new permit in these areas, it would be denied because of the third leg of the stool. And I guess I just, I'm uncomfortable with it. I mean, theoretically, I get it, but from a practical perspective, from a real world perspective, I see that water levels are stable. And yes, okay, that stream that well could be affecting is over appropriated according to the WARS system, but I think that should just be used as an indication that there is the potential for substantial interference, but that maybe there should be a finding of substantial interference only if there is further evidence that stream is actually being depleted. I mean, I'm just wondering, is there a way that we can look at the history of regulation on that stream? Is there a way that we can look at if there is any actual flow data for that stream and compare that with past flow data to see if that stream is in fact showing a historical depletion? I guess I'm just, like I said, I kind of get it. I get the concept that, hey, well, if we've already have a stream that's over allocated and we're taking one drop out of it, then we can't allow that. Well, I guess for one thing, that's a policy decision, and I'm not arguing that that's a bad policy decision or the wrong policy decision necessarily, but it's a policy decision that hasn't been part of the discussion. It's just sort of been assumed. And I think it needs to be part of the discussion. And if it's, you know, if we're going to consider that, well, maybe we can have the potential for substantial interference, but maybe not substantial interference, actual substantial interference. Is there a way that we can kind of make that call? That's what I'd like to throw out there. Because otherwise, you know, otherwise the proposed rules are, and I keep saying this, they are in effect a moratorium on new groundwater permits. Yes, there will be cases where, you know, there's no hydraulic connection. You know, if it's a deep basalt aquifer or a volcanic aquifer, it's not hydraulically connected, and if water levels are stable, then you're good to go. But those are going to be very, very rare, I think. And so, you know, we're going to go from, you know, and I mean, there's a big difference in my mind from just being more careful about issuing new permits and not issuing hardly any at all. You know, to me, there's a big difference there. And I think we need to be a lot more careful. There's no question about that. I guess I'm just not sure that we need to go to the point where we're issuing hardly any new groundwater permits anywhere throughout the state because of this policy decision. Okay, I'll end it at that. Thank you.
Okay,
I'd like to comment.
yeah.
So Eric Schneider Water. I'm coming up to speed on this very complex topic, and I'm not a hydrogeologist and I'm not an expert, but I do see as a concern the removing the distance from the equation. From the standpoint, I work with a lot of hydrogeologists on my municipal wells, and I gotta say, you put two hydrogeologists in a room and having them agree on a topic is almost sometimes not possible. They always have slightly different opinions. So if one hydrogeologist is saying it's interconnected and the other one says it's not, it could radically change without having that distance equation in there, putting some kind of limits. It is possible from that chart where they showed, you know, a well upflow in the recharge area impacting, you know, the lower ones. It's easy to say that, yes, something happens in Eugene and, you know, 30 miles away, there's streams that are being impacted. That argument can be made. Just like in the Boardman area, there's a lot of, you know, decline in water, and I've done wells up there, and it's getting direct recharge from Washington. The hills right across the river it's getting a lot of the recharge. Now, Oregon doesn't have any control over that, but the simple fact is we've got to put some limits on the distance. Otherwise, it can definitely be interpreted however you want, whenever you want, depending on how you feel that day. Second comment I'd like to just finish up quickly is it seems like these rules do not put any kind of consumption. It's like once it's pumped, it's consumed and no longer in the system. Now, ag's the biggest user, but you know, I'm not an expert, but most of the water goes back onto the ground in ag, gets to the streams. It just might not be that stream, it might be connected to another stream. There's evaporation, which that'll eventually produce more recharge. And there's some that's being consumed, but there's no indication here that we're even looking at what the usage is and where it's going and what the impact is. So we're making decisions in the future, and we already have a whole bunch of people who are pumping an unknown amount of water, doing who knows what with it that we're not monitoring. And we're trying to, you know, control something with a lot of variables. So I agree, you know, there's a lot of questions that need to be answered and a lot of data that needs to be gathered. And without that data, it's hard to make good decisions. That's it.
All good points. Thanks. So Jason, I'm Justin, sorry. I'm assuming that these are still active discussions in the RAC.
Yes.
Yeah, so,
Yep.
and Greg, you're part of it, so I'm assuming the things you've brought up are still actively being discussed in the committee. Is that a good assumption?
Well, I don't know. I mean, you know, we sort of thought we'd wrap things up at the end of the 6th meeting, and then now we're going into 2 more meetings. I certainly hope that we're gonna, be able to have some further discussions on these things. I'm anticipating that, but I don't know.
Well, okay, I guess as somebody who's terming out here, I have a feeling that over the next several months, the Groundwater Advisory Committee is gonna have a lot of opportunity to continue to evaluate these rules as they evolve, and at some point, we'll be able to weigh in on the proposed rules. So I don't know that it matters a whole lot that we continue to, drill into it right here, right now, but, if anybody has any more comments, I'll go ahead and looking for hands up and waving, jumping up and down. Go ahead and call her good unless anybody has any other comments. These are tough rules and with huge implications. And I'm glad personally to see that plenty of time and plenty of opportunity still exists for people in this committee and the general public to weigh in, because it's a big deal, but it's the toughest thing. It's the toughest set of rules I've ever seen. You guys have to develop, really.
Well, there's so many variables.
Mhm.
It's just, yeah. And so many variables.
But the main thing is that the impact is huge. Anyway, yeah, Lloyd.
Well, I have one thing, if there's no more public comment, the only thing that I'd have to add is, like the department adjuster clocks. I went downstairs thinking we were an hour ahead.
Yeah, I think put my meter, does anybody want to put forth a motion that
Lloyd, one of our things is we're forward looking.
Daylight
Yes, right.
Other than adjusting our clocks, I propose that we,
everybody here gets to go home early.
adjourn.
Okay, well, anyway, so, I think we've covered the public comments, so we're through the agenda. I would, propose we adjourn. So, do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Okay, and a second, so
All
we're
right.
done. Anyway,
Yep. Well,
good.
thanks for the discussion and the comments. I really
Yeah,
appreciate it.
good.
We're looking forward to continuing the discussion on Friday with the commission and then with the RAC in December. So
Well, we appreciate the opportunity for the discussion too, so. Thank
Yep.
you.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
all right.
Hey, Buns, you're done too, Floyd?
I am.
Yeah, me too. Well, maybe I'll just lurk as just a general